8 months pregnant and banished to the car every night because my husband could not stand my tossing until his own mother caught me freezing and made him pay for every sleepless night. The seatbelt buckle dug into my belly as I curled sideways across the back seat of my Honda Civic. 8 months pregnant, 3:14 in the morning. The dashboard display read 28 degrees outside, and the car wasn't holding much more warmth than that. I pulled the fleece blanket higher over my shoulder. It was the same blanket I kept folded in my trunk now, next to a phone charger, a bottle of water, and a granola bar I never ate. I had a system. 47 nights of practice will do that to a person. The baby kicked hard against my ribs, like she knew I was uncomfortable and wanted me to know she knew it too. I pressed my palm flat against the spot and whispered, "I know, baby." Almost morning. It wasn't almost morning. It was barely past 3. 2 hours earlier, Grant had handed me my keys the way he always did, standing in the doorway of our bedroom in his gray t-shirt, not quite looking at me. "You toss too much," he said. "I've got the Kessler pitch tomorrow. I need my sleep." I didn't argue. I hadn't argued in 6 weeks. Arguing took energy, and I was 8 months pregnant and exhausted in a way that lived in my bones. And some nights it was just easier to take the keys and walk down 2 flights of stairs to the parking lot than to have the same conversation again. "I'll text you when you can come back up," he said, already turning back toward the bed. I sat in my car and listened to a true crime podcast at low volume, the kind of background noise that kept me from thinking too hard about where I was and why. 52 minutes into the episode, my phone buzzed. I thought maybe it was early. It wasn't. It was Megan, my sister, sending a photo of her dog in a Halloween costume, 3 weeks premature because she didn't know what month it was anymore either. I didn't answer. I didn't want her asking where I was because then I'd have to lie, and I was tired of lying. At my last checkup, Dr. Reyes had frowned at the blood pressure cuff and then at me. "Sophie, this is elevated. Something's keeping you from resting. I need to know what it is." "I'm just anxious about the baby," I told her. "New parent stuff." She hadn't looked convinced. I hadn't expected her to be. By 4 in the morning, my hips had gone numb from the angle I was folded into, and I climbed halfway into the front seat instead, reclining it as far back as it would go, which still put me at an angle no 8 months pregnant body should have to sleep at. I stared at the ceiling of my car, at a coffee stain I'd never managed to scrub out, and I thought about the nursery 2 floors above me, yellow walls, a crib we hadn't assembled yet, a husband who was, at that exact moment, sleeping soundly in a bed I wasn't allowed in. At 6:52, my phone buzzed. 4 words, the same 4 words every morning. "You can come back up now. No good morning. No, I'm sorry. Just permission," delivered like I was a dog he'd finally decided to let back inside. I didn't know yet that in 6 weeks this parking lot would be the reason my husband lost his job, his mother's trust, and me. That night, I only knew I was cold, and no one was coming to get me. I climbed the stairs by myself, went back up now, exactly like I'd been told. I was 29 years old that spring, married to Grant for 3 years, together with him for 5. We'd met at a mutual friend's barbecue in Grandview Heights in the summer of 2019, back when I was still a paralegal at a downtown firm, and he was 2 years into his job as an account manager at Ferris & Vance Marketing, a mid-sized agency on North High Street. He'd made me laugh within the first 10 minutes, something about the potato salad, and I remember thinking he had the kind of confidence that filled up a room without stepping on anyone else's space. We got married on June 11th, 2022, at a small venue in Yellow Springs, 60 guests, a string quartet Grant's mother, Linda, insisted on paying for because every wedding needs real music, not a Bluetooth speaker. Linda had been a widow for 6 years by then. Grant's father, Walter, died of a heart attack when Grant was 25, and Linda had raised her younger son, Grant's brother Casey, mostly alone through his last 2 years of high school. She worked as a dental hygienist in Westerville and had never remarried. She doted on Grant in the specific way mothers sometimes dote on the child who reminds them most of the husband they lost. I liked her from the start. She had a directness I appreciated, the kind of woman who told you if your dress didn't fit right instead of pretending it did. There was an earlier moment before the wedding even that I didn't think about again until much later. We'd been dating about 8 months, still new enough that everything felt easy, and Grant had booked us a weekend trip to Hocking Hills for my 26th birthday. The morning we were supposed to leave, I got a stomach bug, bad enough that I couldn't keep water down. I told him we should reschedule. He said the cabin was non-refundable, $340 for 2 nights, and that I should just push through it. That fresh air would probably help more than lying in bed feeling sorry for myself. I went. I spent most of that weekend in the cabin bathroom while he hiked the gorge trails alone. And when he came back the second afternoon, sunburned and cheerful, he told me I'd been a bit of a bummer to plan a trip around. I remember laughing it off at dinner that night, the way you laugh off things you haven't yet learned to take seriously. I filed it under the same folder as the potato salad joke. This is just Grant, a little oblivious sometimes, mostly wonderful. It would be almost 3 years before I understood that obliviousness and convenience can look identical from a distance, and that the difference only shows up when it's your comfort on the losing end of the math. My own parents didn't factor much into any of this. My mother passed away when I was 22, ovarian cancer, and my father remarried a woman named Denise and moved to Sarasota, mostly existing in my life through Christmas cards and the occasional Sunday phone call that ran 12 minutes exactly, timed like he had somewhere else to be. Megan, my younger sister by 2 years, was the only real family I had close by, and even her I kept at arm's length that fall, because admitting to Megan that something was wrong would have meant admitting it to myself first, and I wasn't ready for that yet. Grant and I moved into a one-bedroom apartment at Maple Ridge in August 2021, before we were even married, because the rent, $850 a month, felt more manageable split 2 ways while we saved for a house. Grant handled the bills. He was better with numbers, he said, and it was true that I'd never been the type to enjoy spreadsheets. I trusted him with it the way you trust someone you've built a life with, which is to say completely, and maybe a little carelessly. Looking back, I can find the seam where things started to fray, even though at the time it just looked like an ordinary bad week. It was February 2023, a year before I got pregnant. We'd gone to Asheville for our first anniversary, a long weekend at a rental cabin. On the second night, Grant woke me up at 1 a.m., annoyed, saying my snoring, I don't actually snore or didn't then, had kept him up. I offered to sleep on my side. He said it wasn't enough. He said he needed real quiet before an early flight the next morning, and could I just take a pillow and sleep in the bathtub for a few hours? It was only for one night. I did it. I remember lying in that dry tub with a couch cushion under my head, laughing about it the next morning because it felt absurd, a funny story to tell people at dinner parties. Grant laughed too. He apologized, brought me coffee, called himself an insufferable light sleeper, and I filed it away as a quirk, not a pattern. I didn't know yet that quirks becoming patterns was exactly how this kind of thing worked. Over the next year, small things layered on top of each other the way small things do. Grant started giving me what he called our monthly household number, $400 for groceries and anything personal, deposited into my account on the first of the month, while he handled rent, utilities, and what he described as the boring stuff directly from a joint account I technically had access to but never really looked at. When I asked to see the full budget once, sometime around our second anniversary, he laughed, not unkindly, and said, "Babe, you hate spreadsheets. Let me handle the numbers. You handle literally everything else that matters." I told myself it was a division of labor, not a wall. His mother came around often that year, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with nothing but an excuse to check on us. I remember one visit in September 2023 when Linda pulled me aside in the kitchen while Grant was in the shower and asked, almost too casually, "Is the rent still doable for you two?" I know it went up. I told her we were managing fine. She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've heard an answer they don't quite believe, and didn't push. I found out I was pregnant on July 3rd, 2024. Grant cried when I told him, real tears, and for about 6 weeks after that, things were good between us in a way that made me forget the bathtub, forget the budget, forget the small nod Linda had given me in the kitchen. He rubbed my feet. He read parenting books in bed next to me and narrated the chapters out loud in a voice he thought was funny. He put his hand flat on my stomach every night and told the baby he couldn't wait to meet her. Then, around the end of September, his manager announced the senior account director position was opening up, and Grant wanted it badly. He'd been passed over for it once already, in 2022, and he talked about the promotion the way some people talk about redemption. The extra title meant an $18,000 raise, and Grant had started saying things like, "This is for the baby's future," every time he mentioned the number. That was when the sleep complaints started, small at first. He said my turning over woke him up. He said pregnancy insomnia was making me restless in a way that was, in his words, not fair to ask him to sleep through during the most important stretch of his career. I didn't see it coming, the specific shape it would eventually take. I only knew that somewhere between the bathtub in Asheville and the couch in our living room, I had gotten used to being the one who adjusted. I had gotten good at making myself smaller so his life could stay comfortable. And I told myself, the way I imagine a lot of women tell themselves, that this was just what marriage sometimes asked of you, that it would pass, that once the promotion came through, once the baby came, things would go back to how they'd been in August, before the numbers, before the shower. I was wrong about almost all of it. The sleeping arrangement didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in steps, each one small enough that saying no to it would have felt unreasonable. Step 1 came in early October during my 6th month. I'd started having trouble sleeping on my back, doctor's orders, so I was constantly shifting position, propping pillows between my knees, trying to find an angle that didn't put pressure on my spine. One night, Grant sat up in bed at 1 a.m. and said, "I can't do this every night. I have the Q4 planning meeting Thursday. Can you take the couch just until you figure out a better position?" I said yes. It felt reasonable. I told myself a lot of pregnant women slept apart from their husbands for practical reasons, and this was no different. Step 2 came 2 weeks later. The couch, it turned out, wasn't insulated from the rest of the apartment the way I'd assumed. Grant said he could hear the couch cushions shifting every time I adjusted, could hear my breathing changing, could hear me getting up twice a night to pee. He bought a pair of earplugs first, wore them for exactly 3 nights, and then declared them useless. "I don't know what else to do," he said, rubbing his eyes at the kitchen table one morning. "I'm not trying to be a jerk about this, Soph. I just physically cannot function on 4 hours of sleep and go into that pitch on Monday." "What if I slept in the guest room?" I asked, and then remembered, the way you sometimes remember things that should have been obvious, that we didn't have a guest room. We had a 1-bedroom apartment we'd chosen specifically to save money for the baby's future, a decision that had felt smart at the time and now felt like a trap closing slowly around one specific hinge. Step 3 came on a Tuesday in November, after an argument that started over something as small as a box fan. I liked white noise to sleep. Grant said the fan hummed at a frequency that got into his head, and he couldn't drown it out even with with the earplugs. We argued for 20 minutes, both of us tired, both of us right in our own way, and at the end of it, Grant said, almost like it was a joke, almost like he expected me to laugh. Honestly, at this point, it might just be easier if you slept in the car tonight. It's not that cold yet, just for tonight. I didn't want to, but I was 6.5 months pregnant, exhausted, and out of arguments. I told myself it really was just for one night. It was not just for one night. By step 4, in early December, the car had become the default, not the exception. Grant stopped framing it as a request and started framing it as a shared sacrifice we were both making for the family's future. When I brought up gently that the cold couldn't be good for the baby, he turned the conversation in a direction I hadn't expected. Do you know how much stress I'm under right now? He said. If I don't get this promotion, we don't get the house fund, we don't get the nursery furniture we ordered, none of it. I'm doing this for her. He nodded at my stomach. I need you to trust me that I know what I'm doing. It worked. The way that kind of thing works on someone who is exhausted and pregnant and wants very badly to believe her husband is a good man under pressure rather than something else entirely. I apologized to him. I actually apologized for asking him to sacrifice his sleep for mine, and he accepted the apology like it was owed to him. Step 5, the one that made it permanent, came from Linda, though not in the way you'd expect. In mid-December, she called Grant while I was in the room, and I watched his face change the second he saw her name on the screen. He walked into the bedroom and shut the door, and when he came back out 15 minutes later, he told me his mother wanted to know how the pregnancy was going, nothing more, and changed the subject fast enough that I noticed the seam in it, even if I didn't understand yet what was underneath. That was also the week I saw the notification. Grant's phone was face up on the kitchen counter while he showered, and it lit up with a banking alert. Deposit received, S&P Community Credit Union, 2400 Jaguars. I didn't recognize the bank. We used Huntington for everything. I assumed it was spam, some kind of phishing text disguised as a legitimate alert, and I didn't think about it again until months later, when it would matter more than almost anything else in this story. I tried to push back exactly once, in a real way, not the soft testing I'd done before. It was the second week of January, 9 degrees outside, and I'd woken up at 2 a.m., shivering hard enough that my teeth were chattering, unable to feel my feet. I went back upstairs against the rules we'd apparently established and shook Grant awake. I can't do this anymore, I said. It's 9 degrees, Grant. I could go into labor out there and no one would know. He sat up, and for a second, I thought I'd broken through. Then his face shifted into something practiced, something that looked like hurt, but felt even then like a performance. Wow, he said. I'm sitting here trying to hold everything together. My job, this promotion, us. And you're telling me I'm the bad guy for asking for 8 hours of quiet. I'm not saying you're a bad guy. I'm saying I'm pregnant and I'm freezing. Do you know what it's going to look like if I go into that review exhausted and unfocused? Del Ferris is deciding between me and Bryce Aldana for this. One bad week and it's gone. Everything we planned for her, he gestured at my stomach. The savings, the nursery, all of it, gone. Is that what you want? I remember standing there in the dark, hands wrapped around my own arms, feeling the specific vertigo of being told that my discomfort was a threat to my daughter's future, when it was, in fact, the opposite. I apologized again. I don't remember exactly what I said. I remember going back down to the car. 2 weeks later, at Casey's birthday dinner at Linda's house, I found out that Grant had been telling a version of our situation to his family that inverted it almost completely. Casey's girlfriend, a nurse named Priya, she'll matter again later, asked me gently if I was doing okay. Since Grant said the pregnancy's been really hard on you emotionally, I asked what he meant. She said Grant had mentioned I'd been having a rough time, mood swings, trouble sleeping, and that he was doing his best to be patient with me. I sat at that table with my untouched slice of cake and understood for the first time that I wasn't just losing sleep. I was losing the version of events. Grant had gotten to everyone first. I didn't correct her. I smiled and said pregnancy was hard, which was true, just not in the way she thought. Money became its own weapon around the same time. When I mentioned once that maybe we should talk to someone, a counselor, even just a mediator for the household stuff, Grant laughed in a way that had an edge to it. You want to spend money we don't have on a therapist because you're tired? Do you know what daycare costs? Do you know what a crib costs? I'm trying to build us a cushion here, and you want to spend it on someone to tell us to communicate better. I didn't bring it up again. I told myself I was choosing my battles. I understand now that I had stopped fighting almost every battle at all, and calling it choosing was just a kinder way of describing surrender. Health became the next lever, almost without my noticing the shift. In mid-January, Grant started complaining of headaches, tightness in his chest some mornings, a general sense of being run down that he attributed every time to the accumulated cost of poor sleep. He went to his own doctor, came home with a note about stress management, and started leaving it on the kitchen counter where I'd see it. I'm not trying to guilt you, he'd say whenever I glanced at it. I just think it's important you understand what this is doing to me too. He never once asked what 47 nights in a parked car might be doing to a woman 8 months pregnant or to the daughter she was carrying. I remember thinking, distantly, that if either of us should have had a doctor's note taped to the counter, it probably wasn't him, and then feeling guilty for thinking it, which was its own kind of proof of how thoroughly the math had gotten turned around in that apartment. By late January, when I mentioned to Grant that I wanted to invite Megan over for a weekend before the baby came, he didn't say no outright. He was smarter than that. He said, of course, whenever you want, and then, almost as an afterthought, just maybe don't don't get into the whole sleeping thing with her. She already thinks I'm difficult. I don't need her thinking I'm some kind of monster over something temporary. I didn't invite Megan that month, or the next. By my 38th week appointment, Dr. Reyes stopped asking gently and started asking directly. Sophie, your blood pressure is a 148/96. This isn't anxiety anymore, this is a pattern, and I need to understand what's happening in your life that's keeping it there. I looked at her and felt the lie rise up automatically. The same lie I'd been telling for months. Work stress, I said. It's almost over. She didn't write that down. She wrote something else, something I didn't ask to see, and told me she wanted to check my pressure again in 5 days instead of 2 weeks. I remember sitting in the parking garage after that appointment, engine off, hands on the wheel, thinking about the 4 words that would come the next morning and the morning after that, and doing the math on how many more nights stood between me and my due date. 47 in the end was the actual number of nights I slept in that car. I know because I started counting sometime in February, scratching a tally into the notes app on my phone. 1 line for every morning I climbed those stairs and let myself back into an apartment that had stopped, in every way that mattered, feeling like mine. I want to be honest about something, because the version of this story where I am simply a victim isn't the whole truth. I let it happen. I told myself I was being a good partner, being flexible, not making a big deal out of something temporary. I was 36 weeks pregnant before I let myself use the word that actually described what was happening to me. And even then, I only used it in my own head, alone, in the front seat of my car at 4 in the morning, staring at a stain on the ceiling I never managed to clean. The word was banished. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now, back to the video. 3 days before my due date wasn't a possibility yet. I still had 2.5 weeks left. When Linda showed up unannounced on a Thursday night in February, carrying a maternity pillow she said she'd found half off at a store in Polaris. She let herself into the parking lot with the code Grant had given her months earlier, planning to leave the pillow on our doorstep as a surprise. Instead, she saw my car. She told me later that she almost drove past it, thought it was strange that someone was sitting in a car at nearly midnight, and then she recognized my Ohio State parking sticker in the back window and slowed down. She saw me curled in the back seat, blanket pulled to my chin, shivering hard enough that she could see it through the glass. She knocked. I startled awake, disoriented, and rolled the window down 2 inches before I remembered to be embarrassed. Sophie. Her voice had gone very flat. Why are you sleeping out here? I don't know exactly what broke in me in that moment, but something did. Maybe it was 36 weeks pregnant and 40-something nights of practice at holding it together, finally running out of runway. I told her everything. The couch, then the car, the box fan argument, the 4 words every morning, Casey's birthday dinner, and the version of me Grant had built out of half-truths for his own family. I don't think I stopped talking for 10 minutes, and Linda stood outside my car door the entire time, not moving, her face going paler with every sentence. When I finished, she didn't say anything right away. She got back in her own car without a word, and I thought for one humiliating second that I'd said too much, that I'd embarrassed myself in front of my mother-in-law and she was leaving. She came back 15 minutes later with a camping cot still wrapped in plastic from a sporting goods store on Sawmill Road, the kind of purchase that could only have happened because a store was still open, and she'd walked in and bought the first thing that looked like it would work. Come on, she said, opening my car door herself. We're going upstairs. We climbed the 2 flights together, Linda's hand under my elbow the entire way, and she knocked on our own apartment door 3 times, hard, the way you knock when you're not asking permission. Grant opened it in his gray t-shirt, blinking against the hallway light. Mom, what's going on? Linda didn't answer. She dropped the cot at his feet, plastic wrapping crinkling against the floor. Open it, she said. Mom, it's midnight. What? Open it, Grant. Starting tonight, you sleep on this. In the hallway. If there's not room in the living room, you can't just come in here and I can. And I will, until you tell your wife something I should have told her myself 2 years ago. She turned to look at him fully then, and I watched something pass over her face that I hadn't seen before. Something between fury and grief. Why don't you tell Sophie, who's actually been covering this rent for the last 2 years, Grant? The hallway went very quiet. I remember the specific sensation of the floor seeming to tilt slightly, the way it does sometimes late in pregnancy when your balance is already compromised, and then something knocks it further off. Rent. I thought we were paying our own way. I thought, whatever else was wrong between us, that we were at least broke together, building something together, 2 people stretched thin in the same direction. Linda turned to me, and her voice softened, though the anger underneath it hadn't gone anywhere. For 2 years, I've been wiring $2,400 a month into your joint account, Sophie. Every month, like clockwork, because Grant told me the rent had gone up faster than his raises and you two were struggling to make ends meet while saving for the baby. I never told you because he asked me not to. He said it would embarrass you. I thought I was helping quietly. I didn't know I was helping him lie to you. I did the math without meaning to. $2,400 a month, 24 months, give or take. That was closer to $57,000. And our actual rent, I knew this because I'd seen the lease once, years ago, was $1,850. Even accounting for a modest increase at renewal, there was a gap in that number large enough to drive a car through. I looked at Grant. He wasn't looking at either of us. He was staring at the cot on the floor like it might explain itself. I can explain, he said, which is a sentence I have come to understand means, almost universally, easily that a person cannot. That was the beginning of the actual unraveling, though I didn't understand yet how deep it went. 2 days later, still reeling, still sleeping that first blessed night in an actual bed with Linda camped on our couch like a bodyguard, I called Megan and told her everything in one long, unbroken sentence. The dam finally all the way open. She didn't say I told you so, though she'd have had every right to. She said, "I'm calling you back in 10 minutes. And when she did, she gave me the number of a divorce attorney named Daniel Hale, a friend of her co-workers who specialized in cases with what she called financial weirdness. "Tell me about the money first," Daniel said, in our first call, after I'd finished crying my way through the short version of the last 5 months. He had a calm, unhurried voice that made me feel, for the first time in a long time, like someone competent was in the room. I told him what I knew, which felt embarrassingly small when I said it out loud: a joint account. Grant handled the rent and bills. I'd never seen his real pay stubs. Not really. Just the number he told me every year around review season. Daniel didn't react to any of it the way I expected. Not with pity, just with the specific attentiveness of someone taking notes for a case he already suspected was bigger than the client understood. He brought in a forensic accountant a week later, a sharp, unhurried woman named Anita Shaw, who laid 3 years of bank statements across Daniel's conference table, like a surgeon laying out instruments before an operation. She worked through them for 20 minutes without saying much, and then her expression changed in a way I'd remember for a long time. "Sophie," she said, "did you know your husband had a second checking account?" I hadn't. Of course I hadn't. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a notification lit up again. A phone screen on a kitchen counter in December. A bank name I didn't recognize. A deposit I'd assumed was spam. S&P Community Credit Union, I said slowly. I saw a notification once. I thought it was fake. Anita turned her laptop toward me. There it was. An account opened in October 2023, 14 months earlier, receiving regular deposits that didn't match anything in the joint account Grant and I actually shared. Linda's $2,400 landed there every month, not in our joint account at all. From that hidden account, Grant transferred a portion, enough to cover the real $1,850 rent plus a little more, into our shared account, and quietly kept the rest. "He's been underreporting what actually goes toward your household expenses," Anita said, "and pocketing the difference between what his mother sends and what the rent costs. There's also a pattern of separate deposits here that don't come from Linda at all. Freelance work, it looks like, unreported alongside his salary. He's been doing consulting on the side for at least a year, and not declaring a cent of it. Not to his employer, not to you, not, I'd guess, to the IRS. How much?" My voice didn't sound like mine. She turned the laptop screen toward me and scrolled to the summary page. "Just over $31,000 net, sitting in that account right now. That's before we even get into what he's spent." I sat there with one hand flat against my stomach, feeling my daughter shift under my palm, and understood that this wasn't carelessness. Careless people don't open accounts under a bank name they think their wife won't recognize. This was a plan, built slowly enough that I'd never once seen the shape of it while I was living inside it. Daniel gave me a minute before he kept going. I remember staring at the printout, at the neat rows of dates and dollar amounts, and thinking about all the small ways I had trained myself over the previous year not to ask questions. Every time I'd wondered why our grocery budget felt tight on a $400 stipend, while Grant somehow always had cash for lunches out with coworkers. Every time he'd waved off a question about the account balance with a joke about how boring finances were. I had a paralegal's eye for documents in every other part of my life. I'd caught inconsistencies in discovery filings for other people's divorces for 6 years before this one became mine. I had simply never turned that same attention on my own marriage, because turning it on would have meant admitting what I might find. And some part of me, I think, had already been afraid of the answer long before Anita Shaw confirmed it in a conference room on East Broad Street. "There's something else," Anita said, more gently this time, sliding a second printout toward me. "I cross-referenced the dates on some of these larger transfers against the calendar you gave me, your OB appointments, specifically the ones where your blood pressure spiked." She tapped 3 dates. "Look at these. 3 of my worst appointments. The ones where Dr. Reyes had frowned hardest, asked the most pointed questions, landed within 2 days of unusually large transfers out of the hidden account. Cash withdrawals with no clear destination. I didn't know yet what those withdrawals were for. I would find out. But sitting in that conference room, all I understood was that the stress radiating off my husband those weeks, the stress I'd absorbed into my own body without ever being told its source, had a paper trail. It had dates. It had numbers. It wasn't in my head. It had never been in my head. Daniel filed for divorce 19 days before my due date. Ohio law required Grant to disclose his real income and assets under oath as part of the proceedings. And Daniel warned me that once the filing went in, Grant would either come clean fast or dig in and make it ugly. I was hoping for the first option. I got initially the second. He came home from the process server's visit that afternoon holding the papers like they might combust, and found me in the kitchen with Linda, who had not left the apartment since the night of the cot, ostensibly to help with the nursery, but really, I understood by then, because she didn't trust him alone with me anymore. "You filed?" Grant said, looking at me, not at his mother. "You actually filed, while you're pregnant with my daughter." "I filed because you've been lying to me for over a year," I said. "The pregnancy doesn't change that. If anything, it's the reason I couldn't wait. This is insane. You're going to blow up our entire family family over some money I was going to tell you about eventually. Linda set her coffee mug down hard enough that it rattled against the counter. Eventually, she repeated. Grant, I want you to say that word again, slower, and think about what it means that you needed an eventually at all. Mom, stay out of this. I can't stay out of it. I'm the one who's been wiring you money for 2 years thinking I was helping keep a roof over my grandchild's head. Do you understand what it feels like to find out you were helping fund something else entirely? It's not— Grant stopped, started again. It's not like I stole it. It's my money too. I'm her husband. Whatever's in that account is ours. Then why does it have a bank name neither of us recognized? I said. And why did you never once mention it in a year, in a single conversation about our finances, in every single one of which you told me things were tight? He didn't answer that. He looked for a second like a man doing math in his head and not liking the total. You want to know why I did it? He said finally, and something in his voice shifted, dropped the defensiveness, and went into something closer to self-pity, which I would learn later was its own kind of manipulation, just a different key. Because I was terrified, okay? I was terrified I wasn't going to get that promotion, that we'd be stuck living paycheck to paycheck with a baby, that I wasn't going to be able to give you and her the life I promised you at our wedding. I was building a cushion for us. I was going to tell you the second the promotion came through. I swear to God, I was going to surprise you with it. You made me sleep in a car, I said, so you could build a cushion I didn't know I needed protecting from. That's not— The car thing was separate. That was about sleep. That had nothing to do with— Didn't it? Linda said quietly. Because from where I'm standing, Grant, it looks like you needed her out of the apartment enough nights that you could handle those transfers, those withdrawals, whatever you were doing with that money, without her ever being awake to notice. Am I wrong? The silence that followed answered the question better than anything Grant could have said. I watched something happen on his face that I will think about for the rest of my life. Not guilt, exactly, though there was some guilt in it. Mostly, it was the particular expression of a man realizing, in real time, in front of the two women who had trusted him most, that the story he'd been telling himself about his own good intentions had just been read back to him by someone else, and it didn't hold up. I need you to hear this clearly, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, steadier than I felt. You didn't just lie to me, Grant. You made me sleep in a freezing car, 8 months pregnant, so you could profit off of it, and then you let me believe I was the problem. You let me think I was too anxious, too restless, too much. I apologized to you, more than once, for something you engineered. I felt the baby shift under my ribs and put my hand there without thinking. I hope the $31,000 was worth it, because you've lost everything else that mattered. You lost her before she was even born. And you lost me a long time before tonight. He didn't have an answer for that. He stood in the kitchen, holding divorce papers he hadn't even opened yet, and for the first time since I'd known him, I watched Grant run out of a version of events that made him the reasonable one. Linda didn't look at him again. She looked at me and put her hand on my shoulder and said, "Get your bag. You're staying at my place tonight, both of you." We left him standing in that kitchen alone. 3 days later, Grant tried a different approach. He showed up at Linda's house unannounced, asked to speak to me alone on the porch, and when I agreed, mostly because Linda was standing in the doorway behind me the entire time, he tried something softer. "I know I messed up," he said, "but you're about to have my daughter, Sophie. Doesn't that count for something? Are you really going to raise her as a single mom out of spite?" "This isn't spite," I said, "and I'm not raising her as a single mom because of anything I did. I'm doing it because of what you did, for over a year on purpose. You don't know what it's like," he said, "growing up the way I did, watching my mom struggle after Dad died, feeling like I had to be the one who fixed everything, who made sure our family never went through that again. I was trying to protect us." I recognized the move even as it was happening, the reach for sympathy, the invocation of his father's death, the reframing of deception as devotion. A year earlier, it might have worked on me. I might have softened, found some way to hold both his fear and his dishonesty in the same hand, and call the second one forgivable because of the first. I didn't have that softness left. "I'm sorry about your dad," I said, and I meant it, but that doesn't explain a second bank account with a name designed so I wouldn't recognize it. That doesn't explain a year of telling me we were broke, while you had $31,000 sitting somewhere I didn't know about. Fear doesn't build spreadsheets, Grant. Fear doesn't open accounts at a credit union across town. What you did took effort. It took maintenance. That's not protection. That's a project, and I was never told I was part of it. He didn't have anything to say to that. He stood on the porch for another moment, looking at me the way you look at someone you're realizing, for the first time, you may never fully get back. And then he left. I went back inside. Linda handed me a mug of tea without asking if I wanted one, and I sat down on her couch and, for the first time in months, let myself cry without immediately trying to stop. The professional consequences arrived almost accidentally, in the way these things sometimes do. Grant's promotion review had been scheduled for the last week of February, and as part of the process, Ferris and Vance ran a standard background and financial disclosure check for anyone moving into a director-level role with signing authority over client budgets. It was routine. It was not designed to catch what it caught. The review flagged two things. First, a pattern of expense reimbursements Grant had submitted over the previous 18 months for a home office stipend, a benefit the agency offered remote hybrid employees to offset a portion of their rent, calculated against a home address and square footage he'd reported inaccurately, inflating his monthly reimbursement by several $100s a month, money that had nothing to do with his mother's contributions, and everything to do with simple fraud against his own employer. Second, and more serious, an unreported freelance consulting arrangement with a client that overlapped directly with one of Ferris and Vance's own accounts, a conflict of interest clause violation buried in the employee handbook that Grant had signed 3 years earlier. He didn't get the promotion. 6 weeks later, in the second week of April, he didn't have a job at all. Daniel used the timing to our advantage. Once the divorce filing was public record and Grant's financial disclosures were compelled under oath, Daniel froze the hidden account before Grant could move what was left of it. Just under $19,000 remained, some of it already spent on things I still don't fully know the details of. That frozen money became, over the following months, my daughter's crib, the security deposit on a new apartment, 4 months of breathing room while I figured out what came next. Linda testified at the temporary support hearing in March, not out of spite toward her son, she told me more than once, but because she said she couldn't live with herself if she stayed quiet. On the stand, when Daniel asked her to describe what she'd witnessed the night she found me in the car, her voice didn't waver. I raised that boy to take care of family, she said, not to let his pregnant wife sleep in a car in February so he could collect money for rent I was already covering. I don't know who he became, but I know I won't help him hide from what he did. Casey, Grant's younger brother, took longer to come around. For a few weeks that spring, he sided with Grant reflexively, the way younger brothers sometimes do, calling me over text to ask if I was really sure about the divorce, if there wasn't some middle ground. That stopped the day Priya, his girlfriend, sat him down with the actual bank statements Linda had shared with the family and walked him through the math herself. Casey called me after that, awkward and apologetic, and said, "I didn't know it was like that. I'm sorry I didn't ask more questions. It wasn't much. It was more than Grant had offered." He started sending Norah small things after that, unprompted. A onesie, a secondhand board book, a card on her 1-month birthday signed from Uncle Casey, like he was quietly trying to build a relationship with her that had nothing to do with his brother at all. I let him. Whatever guilt was driving it, the gestures were kind, and I'd learned by then not to turn away kindness just because its timing was complicated. Even my father, distant as he'd always been, called after Megan told him what had happened, the first unscheduled call from him in over a year. I should have asked more questions before the wedding, he said, which wasn't quite an apology, but was, from him, close enough. He and Denise drove up from Sarasota that June to meet Norah, and it wasn't the reconciliation of a lifetime, but it was something, and I found I was grateful for it in a way I hadn't expected to be. Norah was born on March 21st, 11 days after the temporary support order was finalized, 6 pounds 4 ounces, with a full head of dark hair that made the delivery nurse laugh and say she looked like she had opinions already. Linda was in the waiting room. Megan was in the delivery room, holding my hand through the worst of it, and somewhere in the 12 hours between when my water broke and when Norah finally arrived, I stopped thinking about parking lots entirely for the first time in months. Grant came to the hospital the next day. Linda had told him the room number, over my objections, and I let him in for 10 minutes because I didn't want my daughter's first days shadowed by a fight, and because some small, stubborn part of me still wanted him to look at her and understand what he'd risked. He held her for a few minutes, his face doing something complicated, and said quietly, "I really did want this to work, Sophie. I don't know how it got so far from where we started." "I don't think you wanted it to work," I said. "I think you wanted it to look like it was working, and those aren't the same thing." He didn't argue. He handed Norah back to me and left, and that was, for a long while, the last time I saw him look anything other than defensive. Moving out of Maple Ridge took the better part of a weekend in late April. Megan and 2 of my old college friends, Rachel and Deb, showing up with a rented van and a level of righteous energy I hadn't expected, but was grateful for. Word had traveled through our old friend group by then, the way it does in fragments and side conversations, and I found out later that a woman I'd known since our sorority days, Kate, had confronted Grant directly at a mutual friend's engagement party that spring in front of a dozen people after he tried to tell his version of the story: the exhausted husband, the difficult pregnancy, the wife who wouldn't compromise. Kate, who had never been shy about anything, reportedly said, "I heard you had her sleeping in a Honda in February, Grant, so maybe sit this one out." And he'd left the party 20 minutes later. I wasn't there for it. I heard about it 3 separate times from 3 separate people, each version a little more detailed than the last, and each time I felt something in my chest loosen slightly. The specific relief of learning that the truth, once it's out, tends to travel faster and further than the version someone tried to build to replace it. There was a night, about 3 weeks after we brought Norah home to the new apartment, a 1-bedroom on Kenny Road with worse parking and a much better landlord, when the grief caught up with me in a way I hadn't expected. Norah was finally asleep in the crib the frozen account had paid for, and I was sitting on the floor of the nursery in the dark, and I found myself crying not out of anger, but out of something closer to mourning. I thought about the man who'd cried real tears when I told him I was pregnant. I thought about him narrating parenting books out loud in his terrible, funny voice, hand flat against my stomach every night for 6 good weeks. That man had existed. I hadn't imagined him. I just hadn't understood until it was too late how much of him had been real, and how much had been a version he performed when performing cost him nothing. I let myself grieve that for exactly 1 night. In the morning, I got up, made coffee, and kept going, because that's what the next several months required of me, whether I was ready or not. The legal and logistical mess took most of the spring and summer to untangle. Grant, unemployed and furious, tried a handful of desperate moves. First hiring a cheap attorney who argued the hidden account should be split 50-50 as marital property, regardless of how it was accumulated. accumulated, an argument Daniel dismantled easily by pointing to the fraudulent expense reports and unreported freelance income as evidence of intentional financial deception, which under Ohio law weighed heavily against an equal split. Then Grant tried, briefly, to argue for more parenting time than the standard schedule, which Daniel also fought successfully, given the documented pattern of putting his own comfort above basic care for a pregnant partner. Grant ended up with supervised, standard visitation, 2 afternoons a week at Linda's house, and child support calculated off his last verified salary, since his post-firing unemployment didn't retroactively lower what he owed. Then, 3 weeks after Norah came home, the timeline overlapping almost exactly with that quiet, grieving night in the nursery, a woman I'd never met knocked on my apartment door holding a manila folder with Grant's name written on the tab in blue pen. She introduced herself as Priya Nair. It took me a second to place the name, and then I remembered. Casey's girlfriend, the nurse who'd asked me at that birthday dinner months earlier if I was doing okay. The one Grant had painted as concerned about my supposed mood swings. I let her in, mostly out of confusion, and she sat at my kitchen table and told me something I was not prepared for. Before Casey, she said, I dated Grant 4 years ago. We were engaged for about 7 months. She said it plainly, like she'd rehearsed how to get through the sentence without flinching. I didn't know how to tell you at Casey's party. I didn't know how to tell anyone, honestly, for a long time. But when Casey told me what happened with you, the car, the account, I recognized it, not the specifics, the shape of it. She opened the folder. Inside were old bank statements, some copies of emails, and a document I didn't understand at first, a trust agreement dated 9 years earlier, naming Grant as trustee of something called the Walter and June Whitfield Memorial Fund. Grant's grandmother, June, left $85,000 when she passed, Priya said. It was meant to fund a small scholarship in her name at the community college where she used to teach, administered through the family, with Grant named as trustee because he was the oldest grandchild, and she trusted him. I found out about it by accident, back when we were engaged. I was helping him with some tax paperwork, and I saw disbursements that didn't match anything related to a scholarship. When I asked him about it, he told me I'd misunderstood, that some of the fund covered administrative costs. And when I kept asking, he told me I was being paranoid and possessive over money that wasn't mine to worry about. We broke up 2 months later. He told his family I'd gotten cold feet. I sat very still, feeling the shape of something much larger than $31,000 settling over the last 4 years of Grant's life, a pattern that had started before me and would likely have continued after me, if Priya hadn't decided, watching what happened to me, that silence had cost her enough already. I don't know exactly how much is left in that fund, she said. I know it hasn't produced a single scholarship in 9 years. I thought you and your attorney should know it exists. I thought Linda should know too, since it was her mother-in-law's money, and I think she deserves to decide what happens with that information, not have it decided for her the way it was for both of us. She left the folder on my table. When she stood to go, she paused at the door. For what it's worth, she said, I believed for a long time that I was the only one who'd ever have to figure this out about him alone. I'm glad you didn't have to. The $31,000, once Daniel and Anita got their hands on the trust documents and forwarded them to a family law colleague who specialized in fiduciary fraud, turned out to be the smallest piece of what Grant had been managing to keep hidden for most of a decade. It didn't change the terms of my divorce much, legally. That was already settled by then, but it changed everything else. It meant Linda finally understood, fully and without ambiguity, exactly what kind of pattern she'd raised. Not out of cruelty, but out of a slow accumulation of small dishonesties that had never once been interrupted. She hired her own attorney that summer, not against Grant out of spite, but to formally remove him as trustee and have the fund audited, a process that was, last I heard, still ongoing, with Grant facing the very real possibility of restitution he had no way to pay, given that he was, by then, working retail at a hardware store on Sawmill Road and living in a studio apartment above a laundromat. I live now in that same apartment on Kenny Road, the one with the frozen account crib and the landlord who fixed my garbage disposal the same day I called about it. Norah is 4 months old as I write this, and she sleeps most nights, in long, uninterrupted stretches that still feel like a small miracle every time they happen. I sleep next to her crib on a queen mattress I bought myself with the last of the settlement money, the first mattress I've ever owned that no one can tell me to leave, and some mornings I lie there a few extra minutes just because I can, listening to her breathe, before either of us has to be anywhere at all. Grant sees her twice a week, supervised, at Linda's kitchen table, the same table where his mother once dropped a camping cot at his feet. He's civil during those visits from what Linda tells me, quiet mostly. He asked her once, a few months ago, whether I'd ever forgive him, and Linda told me she said, that's not really the question anymore, is it? And he didn't have an answer for that either. The trust fund investigation is still moving through whatever channels these things move through, slow and procedural, and I try not to think about it too often, because it isn't really my fight anymore. Priya still texts me sometimes, small check-ins, and last month she sent a photo of a scholarship announcement from the community college where June Whitfield used to teach, the first one in 9 years, funded finally from what remained of the account after everything was untangled. I cried reading that text, for reasons I'm still working out, something about a dead woman finally getting what she'd actually asked for, 10 years and one very long detour later. Linda still comes by twice a week, sometimes more, and she always texts first now, something she never used to bother with. with, as if she's decided that asking permission to enter a space is the smallest, steadiest way she can prove to me she's changed. She's careful with me now in a way she wasn't before, apologetic in small gestures rather than big speeches. She always brings groceries, always asks before she picks Norah up, always leaves a little early so I have time alone in the evenings. I don't think she'll ever stop feeling responsible for some part of what happened, even though none of it was hers to carry. I've told her that more than once. I don't think she believes me yet. I think someday she might. I think about the version of Grant I fell for at that barbecue in Grandview Heights sometimes, the one who made me laugh about potato salad within 10 minutes of meeting me. I don't think that version was entirely a lie. I think it's possible for someone to be genuinely charming and warm and still be capable of handing his pregnant wife a set of car keys at midnight because his own comfort mattered more than her safety, night after night, running the same math on which one of us he loved enough to actually inconvenience himself for. I think that's the saddest part of this whole story, honestly. Not that he turned out to be someone else entirely, but that he was always exactly who he was. And I spent years mistaking his convenience for love because it was easier than asking harder questions. There's a particular kind of peace that doesn't look like triumph from the outside. Mine looks like a nursery with yellow walls I finally got to paint myself. A mattress I chose because it was comfortable and not because it was cheap. A daughter who kicks in her sleep the exact same way she used to kick against my ribs in the back seat of a Honda Civic in a frozen parking lot. Some nights I still toss and turn. Norah's cries wake me more reliably than any insomnia ever did, more than any box fan or restless leg or 8 months pregnant discomfort Grant once decided he couldn't live with. The difference is that now, no one hands me my keys. No one tells me to go to the car. I turn over, I settle back down, and in the morning, nobody sends me 4 words granting me permission to come home. I'm already home. I never have to ask. I used to think the worst night of my life was the one where I sat in that parking lot at 3:14 in the morning, a seatbelt buckle digging into my belly, watching frost creep across the windshield while my husband slept 8 feet above me in a bed I wasn't allowed in. I don't think that anymore. I think the worst part was everything that came before it. Every small surrender that taught him it was safe to ask for one more. Every apology I offered for a discomfort he'd engineered. Every night I told myself this was just what marriage sometimes asked of good, flexible women. The parking lot wasn't where it started. It was just where I finally ran out of road. I got a family out of it anyway, not the one I planned for. A better, smaller, more honest one. My daughter, my sister, and unexpectedly, a mother-in-law who chose truth over loyalty to her own son the night she found me freezing in a car and decided that was one sacrifice too many. I try to remember that some nights when the grief still finds me. Something real was lost. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Sometimes, rocking Norah at 2 in the morning, I catch myself doing the math again, out of old habit. Counting nights, counting dollars, counting the distance between what someone promises you and what they actually do when no one else is watching. It's a hard habit to unlearn. I don't know that I ever fully will, but I've started noticing the other side of that math too. The side I spent years not tracking. Megan showing up with a rented van on a Saturday without being asked twice. Linda leaving groceries on my counter and slipping out before I can insist she stay for dinner. Dr. Reyes at my 6-week postpartum visit, taking my blood pressure, finding it normal for the first time in 5 months, and just nodding, quietly satisfied, like she'd been waiting the whole time for the numbers to finally tell the truth I hadn't been able to say out loud. That's what I want Norah to grow up watching, not the absence of hard things, because I can't promise her that. Just the presence of people who show up for the hard things anyway, and don't send her a text granting permission to come home. She'll always already be home. Something real was lost, building this. But something real is also here now, sleeping soundly 2 feet from my bed, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure no one ever hands her a set of keys and calls it love.